Good day. I'm going to begin this video with a report in the Daily Telegraph about the situation on the battlefronts, which I've not actually seen confirmed in any other place, but which I presume is true. This report says that President Zelensky of Ukraine has carried out an unscheduled visit to the town of Bakhmut. Bakhmut, which is of course this place which is now under heavy siege by the Russians and which has been referred to by many people, including by Ukrainians, as a meat grinder and a place where the Ukrainian army is suffering very heavy losses. Well, it is an interesting fact that Zelensky has indeed been to Bakhmut, and I'm afraid, as far as I'm concerned, it is an ominous one, because Zelensky going to Bakhmut appears to me to indicate that he is determined to keep fighting in Bakhmut, to hold on to Bakhmut for as long as possible, and that his purpose in visiting Bakhmut, if it has indeed happened, is to make it clear both to the world at large and to the people of Ukraine, and first and foremost to the Ukrainian military, that Bakhmut will not be surrendered. In other words, that the fight there for Bakhmut will go on till the end. I have to say I find this ominous because thousands, hundreds at least, or perhaps thousands of men are going to die fighting over this place, which we're told is insignificant, but it is consistent with what we're hearing about the fact that the Ukrainians are building trenches in the middle of the city. Now, I want to again qualify all that I've just said by saying that this report has appeared in the Daily Telegraph, and therefore I assume it is correct. I've not seen it reported in other places. So it may be that this is an error. Zelensky did indeed visit Bakhmut many months ago, and perhaps someone in the Daily Telegraph editorial office has got the dates visits confused. That sort of thing does happen. But I would have thought that a newspaper like the Telegraph would get this kind of information right. Anyway, no doubt by the time this video appears, you will have more information about whether or not Zelensky has been to Bakhmut or not. But if he has, as I said, it is an ominous development. Everywhere else on the battlefields, there are continuing reports about the intense fighting that is going on in Donbass, around Marinka, where the Russians now claim that they've pushed the Ukrainians, the remaining residual Ukrainian forces in Marinka, to places that are undefendable. I'm not quite sure what that means, but anyway, that's what the Russians are saying. And so fighting continues in Marinka, fighting continues in close to Avdiivka, fighting continues in Ugledar, fighting continues in all sorts of places. So the fighting in Donbass continues, and it's important to say that the Russians are clearly now in the ascendant. They've clearly gained the initiative over Ukraine in the Donbass fighting, and if their advances are not spectacular, they are probably important in the sense that they're making the entire Ukrainian position in Donbass look increasingly unstable, and it does increasingly seem as if the Ukrainian army is now suffering impossibly high losses trying to defend this ground. Now, in a program that my colleague Alex Christoforou and I made about the situation in Ukraine, which we published on the Duran yesterday, my colleague Alex Christoforou made the point that Zelensky, in his latest interview for the French media, was sounding even more grandiloquent and, shall we say, disconnected from things than usual. And he did indeed. I mean, he made all kinds of comments. I discussed some of the things that he said in my previous video. And I can't help but think that this is an indicator of the extreme stress that he must be under at this present time, that there's, with a situation, a military situation, which after all the triumphalist language of the last few weeks is clearly getting extremely bad, with all the indications that it is going to become worse very soon and very fast. Now, let's talk about other things that have been going on, perhaps things that are not directly involved, connected to the battlefields, but which are in fact related to events on the battlefields. The first is, yesterday I discussed the visit by Putin to Minsk and his meeting there with Lukashenko and the president of Belarus, and as was clearly indicated, this was a huge visit, a major Russian delegation, including Shoigu and Lavrov, Russia's defense and foreign ministers, and they had meetings with every single top official in Belarus, including Belarus's prime minister. And we're now getting lots of reports pouring in from the Russians and the Belarusians about the nature of what was discussed. And it's now clear that the two countries, Belarus and Russia, are moving rapidly towards economic and military integration, though Putin went out of his way to make it clear that the two countries would remain sovereign and independent of each other. That is to say, there are no plans, at least for the time being, for Russia and Belarus to unite into a single state. In other words, for Russia to annex or absorb Belarus. But in all other respects, as I said, they seem to be moving forward very rapidly now towards a complete program of very intense integration. And Putin had a great deal to say about this, and in particular, he talked at some length about military developments alongside all of the others. And he gave a very clear impression that the two militaries, the Belarusian and the Russian militaries, are now to all intents and purposes being merged. Now, this is what Putin is reported to have said in a press conference in Minsk. A press conference, by the way, from which the Western media were notably absent. I presume they were either excluded from it, or perhaps they're not based in Minsk anymore. But this is what Putin said about the military cooperation that's going on between Russia and Belarus over the course of this press conference. I would like to remind you that as part of the consistent implementation of the Russia-Belarus military doctrine, we work on joint military planning and have an operational Russia-Belarus regional force grouping. Our country's divisions and military units currently undergo coordination training in Belarus. We have created a joint air defense system that is already on combat duty. That is important. It means that Belarus is now part of what is in effect the Russian air defense complex. Belarus's air defense is now integrated with Russia's. We have agreed to continue taking all necessary measures, that's always an important word, all necessary measures, to ensure the security of our countries, prioritizing training of the troops, improving their combat readiness, and continuing the practice of regular joint exercise and other operational and combat events, mutual supplies of essential weapons, and producing new military equipment together. Now, all necessary measures is a hint at nuclear weapons. So what Putin is saying is that, yes, they're working together on all of these sort of things, they're training together, they're developing weapon systems together, but Belarus is now firmly under the Russian nuclear umbrella. In other words, it's becoming part of the Russian nuclear defense concept. It is now clearly not just a partner, but an outright ally, and in fact, an ally of an entirely different quality to all the various other countries with which Russia maintains close relations, including those in the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And then, as if to make it absolutely clear that the words all necessary measures do indeed mean nuclear weapons, and to spell out exactly what this all means, Putin then went on to say, I believe it is also possible to continue implementing President Lukashenko's proposal on training the Belarusian army combat aircraft crews that have been re-equipped for potential use of air-launched ammunition with special warheads. Special warheads, well, he doesn't say nuclear warheads, but I think in combination with those previous words, all necessary measures, that's clearly what he means. And then, again, to put the question entirely beyond all doubt, Putin says, I want to stress that this form of cooperation is not our invention. For example, the United States have conducted similar activities with their NATO allies for decades. These coordinated measures are extremely important in view of the tensions at the external borders of the Union state of Belarus and Russia. Now, what Putin is referring to here is that the United States does indeed provide cooperation with NATO air forces, Germany's in particular, whereby German pilots, for example, flying German aircraft, are trained to deploy missiles which could be used with nuclear warheads. So Putin is making the direct analogy with what the Americans do, and it's clear that that is in fact what the Belarusians now are being trained for. They're being trained, the pilots of Belarusian aircraft are being trained to deploy and launch missiles which have the capability of using nuclear warheads. So this is a dramatic development. It demonstrates the intense integration of the two countries. And of course, when we're talking about military integration, we have to mean a very high degree of political integration as well. The Russians would not be taking these sort of steps in Belarus if they were not confident that the political situation in Belarus is both stable and will remain stable and firmly allied with Russia, notwithstanding the fact that Lukashenko himself is probably going to leave the scene at some point in the foreseeable future. So, very close military integration between Russia and Belarus. Now, how does this affect Ukraine? Is this a sign that the Russians are preparing to advance on Kiev, launch their attack on Kiev from Belarus, and that the Belarus army is expected to participate in this operation? Well, I have to say, if that is the plan, there was absolutely no hint of it in any of the discussions, at least in any of the public comments that came after the discussions which have taken place in Minsk. On the contrary, Putin's spokesman, Peskov, has appeared to cast doubt, cold water on the whole idea. He seems to say that there's actually no plan to involve Belarus directly in the fighting in Ukraine. Now, I don't know whether that is true or not. I'm going to make a guess. I think it is. I think there is no plan on the part of the Russians to deploy troops from Belarus in Ukraine. I think they realize that this might have political repercussions within Belarus itself. I think what they want to do is to strengthen the Belarus army to the point where it can defend itself and perhaps act as a confident cover for the Russian army if it decides to use Belarus as a launching point to advance deep into Ukraine itself. In fact, I can easily imagine that there's been a quid pro quo done. The Russians have come along to Minsk and said to Lukashenko and his officials, probably this has been a long ongoing thing, that, we would like to do a repetition of what we did back in February. We would like to advance from Belarus deep into Ukraine. Perhaps we got all kinds of plans there. But no doubt they're sharing their plans with Lukashenko to some degree. Again, I am making no prediction about timing. And Lukashenko very plausibly said, that's absolutely fine, but in return you must agree to beef up the Belarusian army, including by providing us with access to the kind of technologies and the kind of training that might, in the event of a crisis, involve rapid deployment of nuclear weapons by the Belarus Air Force itself. So that, I suspect, is part of the deal that was done, though it's important to stress that the economic agreements, which are enormously comprehensive and which, as I said, do seem to tie up the two countries, well, they have been they should not be overlooked, and they do again point to a clear direction of travel of very deep integration between these two countries, these two societies, and these two economies as they prepare for the further conflict, not just with Ukraine, but with the West as well. So an important meeting, and one which must, I would have thought, heighten Ukrainian concerns about a new front in the north coming from Belarus, with a new threat of a major Russian advance, either on Kiev itself, which is what General Zelensky, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, appears to think, or perhaps towards Volyn, towards the western regions of Ukraine, with the intention of cutting off supplies from there. I've expressed my skepticism about these plans in the past. I continue to hold to it. My own view is that the major Russian offensive, when it comes, will be from Donbass and in Kharkiv region and possibly Zaporozhye region, in those sort of places. I don't think that the Russians are aiming for a strike from the north. I think that they're engaged in a pinning operation, letting the Ukrainians think that, sending troops there, obviously, to exploit any opportunities that might arise, keeping large numbers of Ukrainian troops from what is now clearly depleting Ukrainian military tied up in the north, while General Surovikin finishes off the south and west. The south and east. That is my own guess. I'm not a military person, as I've said many times. I'm not getting the plans of the Russian General Staff. I don't know what their plans are, but for what it's worth, that's what I think is more likely and is most consistent with the sort of things that Putin and Surovikin have been saying up to this point. Now, I was reading again in the Daily Telegraph, by the way, a rather extraordinary editorial, rather shrill editorial, in which Putin was referred to as a cowardly figure. Well, the British like to throw this expression cowardly at any political leader that they, foreign political leader that they don't like. I'm not quite sure why they think Putin is a coward, but I'm not going to discuss this. But anyway, this particular editorial, as well as abusing Putin to an extraordinary extent, as is now typical of the British media, spoke about his relative invisibility over the last few weeks, dredging up yet again the topic of his postponed press conference in Moscow and his postponed meeting of the Federal Assembly, or so it seems to me. Well, all I will say about that is that I don't know what part of the Russian news the Daily Telegraph is following, because I have never known Putin as busy as he is at this present moment in time. He is in fact keeping a frenetic pace, because as soon as he returned to Moscow from Minsk, he was addressing Russia's spies. He had a meeting with the people of the security service, maybe not spies exactly, but anyway, the people who are involved in security, state security issues, who are internal control issues. It's their holiday, apparently. It was their holiday, and Putin has now given an address to them and probably met with these people. Unsurprisingly, we're given very little information as to the location and the nature of this meeting, but anyway, it did take place, and Putin attended. Now, Reuters has given an account of this meeting, in which he spoke about Putin admitting that the situation in the 4 regions of Ukraine is that have joined Russia, united with Russia, been annexed by Russia, that it has become very difficult. And what Reuters is, of course, trying to do, and has been consistently trying to do since the start of this war, is that when it reports Putin's words using its own translations, it gives the impression that Putin is admitting that the situation is difficult to the point of becoming desperate, and that there is some sort of a crisis, and that the Russians are very concerned about the situation. Well, I'm going to read what Putin actually said as translated by the Kremlin's own website. And this is the Kremlin website's translation of Putin's comments into English. I would like to call attention to the security agency units that have begun their work in Russia's new regions. Yes, you are faced with difficult tasks now. The situation in the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics and the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions is extremely complicated. But the people who live there, Russian citizens, are counting on you and your protection. And your duty is to do everything in your power to ensure their safety and respect for their rights and freedoms. On our part, we will continue to supply the new units with modern equipment and weapons, as well as experienced personnel. And if you read the rest of his comments, it's quite clear that he is talking about what he defines as internal terrorist activity. And terrorist activity in Russia, terrorist activity obviously in the 4 regions, what the Ukrainians would call partisan activity, and of course spying. And it is indisputable that Ukraine has developed quite sophisticated networks of agents and sympathizers in all the 4 regions, including, by the way, in Donbass. And now that these 4 regions are formally part of Russia, the Russians are able to extend the operation of their security services, the FSB, the National Guard, all of them, deep into these places, and do what they previously did in places like the Caucasus, for example, which is identify, locate, track down, arrest all of the people who are engaged in spying and partisan activity, let's call it that, on behalf of Ukraine. And about a week ago, there was reports of a major dragnet, Russian dragnet, operating in the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, all sorts of people being rounded up who were alleged to be sympathizers and supporters of Ukraine. And apparently the same thing is now going to happen in the other 2 regions. Now, in my opinion, this is not a major or important story. Why have I devoted so much time to it? It is for the same reason that I often go back and quote things that Putin said, or at least the translations, the official translations of what Putin said. I say this because the Reuters version has been circulating everywhere, about the Russia facing a very difficult situation in these four regions, whereas, as you can see, what Putin was saying was rather different. Let me repeat again any quotation of Putin's that you see in any media, apart from the Russian, you should take extremely carefully. I know of no political leader in the world who is so regularly misquoted in what he says. Anyway, so much for all of that. So the Russians are obviously in the process of making their plans. We've seen Putin. He's had meetings with Surovikin and his staff. He's spoken to his National Security Council. He's come to Belarus. He's met with Lukashenko. He's now had a meeting with the internal security people about, rounding up spies and partisans, saboteurs, terrorists, call them whatever you like, in the four regions. And as I said, the rumors are that he's going to have another big meeting very soon in the run-up to the New Year holiday this week at some time with the members of the military collegium of the Russian Defense Ministry, the grouping that basically brings together the entire military leadership of Russia. So, far from being invisible or hiding, Putin is in fact extremely active at the moment, more active than I've practically ever known him, and that is saying something. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the state of the diplomacy about this war recently, and a lot of it flows from those very interesting interviews given by General Zelensky, General Syrskyi, the two top Ukrainian commanders, President Zelensky, to The Economist, as well as another interview given by Defense Minister Reznikov, also to the British media. And there's been some media coverage, some discussion about what this all means. Not, it must be said, very much in the big mainstream media places. You won't find much discussion in The Guardian, for example, or the New York Times about what all of this means, what all these discussions mean. You won't find it there, but it is appearing in some rather interesting places. Now, there was one very interesting article, at least I thought it was interesting, in the Turkish newspaper, Sabah. Now, Sabah should not be confused with another Turkish newspaper called Daily Sabah, but the editorial writer of Sabah, a man called Mehmet Barlas, is a fairly well-known journalist in Turkey, and I understand that he is somebody who's known to be relatively sympathetic and fairly close to the Turkish government, to President Erdogan's government. And Barlas, in this editorial, writes about Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine in ways that I have never seen any top Turkish journalist or official use up to this point. Now, I say that because the official position of the Turkish government, of Erdogan's government, is that they have some kind of equidistance between Ukraine and Russia, that they seek to remain on good terms with both countries, and that Turkey isn't siding with either side against the other in this conflict, either with Ukraine or with Russia in this conflict. But Barlas, in this editorial for Sabah, basically blows that all apart. Now, this is what he says. Now, I'm using a machine translation, but I don't think it's very far from an accurate version of what he actually wrote. The global powers did their best so that relations between Turkey and Russia would deteriorate, and Turkey's situation would be like the current situation in Ukraine. As it will be remembered, the Turkish Air Force shot down a Russian plane in 2015, and the veil of secrecy has still not cleared. I don't think I need to remind you how much our relations with Russia deteriorated and how much our economy suffered. Having survived these ordeals, Turkey, Russia, or rather Erdogan, Putin, succeeded in developing a relationship based on mutual respect. Turkey has removed itself from the position of being NATO's land forward arm against Russia. In other words, it's, major ally, NATO's major ally in this part of the world against Russia. We can see how important this is for Turkey by looking at the vanishing Ukraine, which is led by a Western clown. Or we can see it by looking at Europe, which is currently experiencing a major energy crisis and where thousands of people are feared to die from the cold this winter. Some seemingly innocent political choices can have very vital consequences. For example, the people of Ukraine said, "Let's laugh a little." The West also piled up the money and the guns. But in the current situation, the Ukrainian people have neither electricity, water, nor heating systems. They've all collapsed. The oppressed Ukrainian people are left at the mercy of the Russian army, waiting to be invaded. It is an exemplary situation in which Ukraine went on an adventure after fake heroes, relying on the United States and the EU. Now, as I said, I've never seen Turkish journalists or officials talk about the conflict in Ukraine in that way, and I do wonder what's brought it about, and I suspect that the Turks are very well informed about the situation in Ukraine itself. They got people on the ground there, and of course they will have also been reading General Zelensky's comments in The Economist, and the fact that General Zelensky is now talking about the fact that he might one day have to make the same kind of address to the Ukrainian army that General Mannerheim made to the Finnish army in March 1940 after the Finnish army had been defeated by Soviet Russia. So that's one interesting take on things, current take on things from Turkey. Now, there's been others, and there's a commentary by the former British diplomat Alistair Crook, who is, I should say, one of the most interesting and insightful writers on affairs, generally international affairs generally. I don't always agree with him, I should say, but he's written a very interesting piece, and it's entitled "Managing the Ukraine Denial Narrative." Now, this reads, I'm going to use my glasses now, look around, the tectonic plates of geopolitics and geofinance are shifting radically away from an increasingly flailing West. The inflection has begun. It has been messaged by the Financial Times and The Economist, the two media organs that so faithfully transmit any replacement narrative to the global Sherpas, those who carry the baggage up the mountain on behalf of the mounted nabobs. To those who don't know, Sherpas, nabobs, these are all language which perhaps in Britain we associate with the British Empire. Nabobs in particular was a word that was used in Britain to describe senior British officials who were in charge of administering India. Anyway, putting that aside, Crook goes on to say, The Economist leads with interviews with Zelensky, General Zelensky, and Ukraine's military field commander, General Syrsky. All three are interviewed in The Economist no less. Such a thing does not occur by happenstance. It is messaging intended to convey the ruling class's new narrative to the golden billion who will all read and absorb it. On the surface, it is possible to read The Economist piece as a plea for more money and many more weapons, but the underlying messaging is clear. Anyone who underestimates Russia is heading for defeat. The Russian force mobilization was a success. There is no problem with Russian morale, and Russia is preparing a huge winter offensive that will start soon. Russia has huge reserve forces of up to 1.2 million men, whereas Ukraine now has 200,000 men who are militarily trained for conflict. The writing is on the wall. In other words, Ukraine cannot win. It is appended with a huge shopping list of sought-after weapons, but the shopping list is pie in the sky. The West simply does not have them in inventory, period. And then Crook goes on to say the FT's big read, by contrast, is a venting of deep Western anger at those Russian reformist Siloviki technocrats who, instead of breaking with Putin over the special military operation, instead shamefully enabled the Russian economy to survive Western sanctions. The message uttered through clenched teeth is that Russia's economy has successfully survived Western sanctions. And then Crook says that the fact that all of these pieces are appearing in places like the Financial Times and The Economist point to a change in perspective in the West, and that perhaps at some point before long we could see some kind of attempt made by the Western powers to distance themselves from this particular conflict. I'm going to say that on this last point, I am not so sure. I don't think we are anywhere close to that point yet when the Western powers are prepared to publicly give up on this adventure in Ukraine. I think far too much in terms of reputation, not to mention arms, money, and all these things has been invested in this whole Ukrainian affair for Western leaders to simply turn away and allow the situation in Ukraine to take its course. I think, on the contrary, that there will be some sort of frantic effort to try and find some kind of magic bullet that will again solve the West's problems. And I have to say, I tend to agree with comments made by those people who fear that we're looking more at the prospect of escalation rather than retreat. I see all of these signals, like these articles that are appearing in The Economist and the Financial Times, Rishi Sunak's strange audit about what's going on in Ukraine, conflicting signals coming out of Washington that I talked about, not as signs that the Western powers are preparing to change their policy or reverse policy on Ukraine, but rather that there is a battle underway between hardliners and, shall we say, moderates, though I don't know how moderate they really are. The moderates trying to find some way to de-escalate this crisis, looking for some way to achieve some kind of face-saving compromise, which might not last very long, but might allow the West to tiptoe away from what's happened with something like its dignity intact. And the hardliners, who, as far as I'm concerned, remain overwhelmingly in the ascendant, who still want to press this conflict to the uttermost limit in the hope and belief that something somewhere will happen which will give them that victory over the Russians, which they so earnestly seek, and which will only be complete when there is regime change in Moscow. So that's what I see. I see this more as evidence of an internal conflict. By the way, since I'm on that point, The Economist also acknowledged that there is some kind of, or that there is a possible internal conflict underway in Ukraine itself. There is a reference in the article to the fact that there are supposedly strains between Zelensky and Zelensky. We've talked about this many times on this channel. I've talked about this many times on this channel. And The Economist has this rather interesting paragraph. On several occasions, General Siersky, that is the Grand Force commander, was actually senior in the chain of command to General Zelensky, appointed to be the commander-in-chief of the entire armed forces in July 2021. Some political actors behind the scenes may be using that fact in an apparent attempt to foment tensions between the two. Rumours even persist that the presidential administration, which is to say Zelensky, might be inclined to replace the popular but independent-minded Zelensky with his former boss, Siersky. Cracks of disunity have high-placed Western military officials worried. The two generals on their part say they fully trust each other and wish to stay out of politics. Siersky is uncomfortable with the conversation. The army is outside of politics, he says. It is how it should be and how the law demands it be. Well, of course, the Ukrainian army is a deeply political and ideological army. It is most definitely not outside politics. Now, what I find interesting about that paragraph is that, of course, there's been lots of discussion in Russian Telegram channels, especially, about alleged stresses between Zelensky and Zelensky. And there's also been lots of discussion about this within Ukraine itself, that the two, Zelensky and Zelensky, supposedly don't get on terribly well with each other. But officially, it's always been denied. We've always been told by the Ukrainian government that there's no truth to these claims, that Zelensky and Zelensky get on perfectly well. Well, the Economist now admits that there are political actors in Ukraine who are actually gunning for Zelensky. They're very suspicious of Zelensky. We're not told who these political actors are, but there's the reference to the presidential administration, which all but identifies Zelensky himself as the person who's unhappy with Zelensky. And we also hear that there's attempts being made to set General Siersky and General Zelensky at odds with each other, with the possible view to replacing Zelensky with Siersky. And importantly, Western military officials are said to be worried about this. In other words, they are worried about the fact that there are these problems in Ukraine, that there are these cracks appearing within the Ukrainian leadership. So, conflict, internal conflicts in the West about how to go forward, internal conflicts in Kiev, in Ukraine, effectively admitted by the Economist itself. What about Moscow? Are there any conflicts there? I'm sure there are. I'm sure there have been at various points in this war, periods of time when the Russians have found it difficult to agree with each other on a particular strategy. But I think that over time, a consensus has been hammered out, and it's a consensus which Putin has undoubtedly facilitated. And that consensus is that we can't rely either on the Ukrainians or on the West to negotiate with us. What we must do is focus now on the war, win that war in whatever way we can, the right way for us, perhaps not immediately, not with any dramatic offensives, maybe incrementally through attrition, but win it one way or another. And that if either the Ukrainians or the Western powers come to their senses and come up with proposals, yes, we will certainly listen to them, but we will listen to them with great caution, because after all that's happened, we have no real trust for anything that the West and the Ukrainians say. We no longer believe or have any reason to suppose that any offer that they make is sincere and genuine. I think that's where the Russians have come to. I think that's where they are. I think the decisions were probably finalized in September with the appointment of Surovikin, the creation of this headquarters around him, the mobilization of all those reservists, the call-up of all those reservists, the call-up of all those volunteers, and also the setting up of the coordinating council to mobilize the economy. And whilst I'm on the subject of the economy, we've had some economic news. The Russians now seem to think that GDP contraction this year will be smaller than previously predicted. It had been predicted a few weeks ago that it would be 2.9%. There's some tentative suggestions that it could be 2.5%, perhaps even as little as 2%, though that might be rather too optimistic at the moment. So the Russian economy, as Alistair Crook correctly says, has come through the sanctions. In addition, and perhaps more interestingly, the chief executive of Rostec, that's the company, or I should say rather the conglomerate, that in its many component parts forms the greater part of Russia's military-industrial complex, has now been making statements about what the state of arms production is in Russia. And he talks about major increases in tank and armoured vehicle production. And it is indeed the case that we're seeing lots of new T-90M tanks, Russia's most modern tank in actual service, apparently appearing in Donbass and on the battlefields. They've not yet been deployed in action, apparently, in any great numbers, but they are starting to appear in great numbers. We're seeing more and more drones, and this isn't, I'm not talking here and now about the Geran 2 drones that Russia is either producing under Iranian license or maybe importing directly from Iran. I'm talking about lots of various types of Russian drones, from kamikaze drones like the Lancet to other surveillance drones. Apparently there are now many more of them in the skies than there used to be, and production of those has increased as well. And there's hints that ammunition and missile production has increased multiple fold, though of course we're given no actual figures. However, whilst I am talking about matters of economy, we've had some really very strange news, and this comes from Transneft, the Russian company, state-owned company, that actually manages the pipelines through which oil is transported or has been transported to Europe. And Transneft says that they've now received orders for more pipeline oil from Poland and Germany for 2023. Now this is really extraordinary because, of course, as I'd understood it, the European Union had announced way back in the early summer that it was ending imports of Russian oil, or at least Russian pipeline oil, at least as of the end of this year. But the Russians are now saying that they're receiving orders, big orders, or big requests for orders from Poland and Germany for large amounts of Russian oil. Now, you go back in time, I said that I assumed that the oil price cap idea, which has now, by the way, been supplemented by an equally unworkable gas price cap idea, that the oil price cap idea seems to complement the oil import ban, but perhaps might be intended to replace it. In other words, that the Europeans were quietly acknowledging that they would be importing, that they would be continuing to import oil from the Russians, and that rather than simply stop imports, they would try to place a price cap on the oil that they were importing from Russia. And if this report, if this claim from the Russians that the Poles and the Germans are now asking for, are putting in requests for orders for Russian oil are true, then that is indeed how it looks like. It looks as if the Europeans, at least the Poles and the Germans, indeed do see the oil price cap not as a complement to the oil import ban, but rather as a replacement for the oil import ban. Now, the big question is, will the Russians agree to provide the oil? I presume that if oil is supplied to the Poles and the Germans and the Poles, in accordance with the oil price cap, will insist that the oil price cap applies to it. The Russians have up to now said that they're not prepared to supply oil to any country that administers the oil price cap. So we'll see whether the Russians are prepared to go along with that. Maybe these bids from Poland and Germany aren't real. Maybe they are intended just to test Russian resolve, to find out whether the Russians are actually serious when they say that they will not abide by the oil price cap. They will not provide oil to countries that operate this oil price cap. So we'll see. But it is a strange development, and it shows that some sanctions, like the oil import ban that we were hearing so much at the beginning of this year, well, they're not quite what they seem. So, where are we? Ukraine apparently determined to fight on in Donbass. It's bleeding. It's suffering very heavy losses. Its ammunition is almost out. It's struggling to replace its tank and armored forces, but it still nonetheless wants to go on fighting in Donbass. It won't give up in places like Bakhmut or Marinka, whatever the cost, even though that cost seems disproportionately large. The president of Ukraine, President Zelensky himself, is certainly, definitely committed to this strategy, even as he appears increasingly out of touch and unfocused, as this really rather bizarre interview he gave to French television shows. And we now have, in effect, confirmation from The Economist that his military leaders, Zelensky and Syrskyi, are increasingly unhappy, both with him and possibly, just possibly, with each other. And that these tensions at the top of the military leadership in Kiev are causing concerns about Western military officials. Meanwhile, we see the Russians methodically preparing. We've had Putin going to Minsk. We've had all this elaborate series of agreements there, which aren't just focused on Ukraine, but where, of course, Ukraine is clearly an important issue. It was interesting to notice, by the way, that at the press conference, there were no questions about Ukraine at all. So presumably the media had been briefed, the Russian and Belarusian media had been briefed in advance not to ask those questions. So we see a lot going on the Russian side. And we see some evidence of a debate in the West, with more people clearly expressing doubts and in Turkey, where they talk about these things perhaps in a more forthright way, those doubts being expressed quite openly in articles that are appearing in the Turkish media, which refer to Zelensky as a Western clown. Where is all this going? Well, it looks as if at the moment there is no sign of any kind of political or diplomatic breakthrough. As I said, Ukraine doesn't seem to be capable at the moment of acknowledging that disaster is on the horizon. One senses that Zelensky is now reduced to hoping that something will turn up rather than having any real plan about what to do. And one also senses that in the West, Western leaders are too weak and too distracted by their mounting domestic problems to try to come up with a coherent strategy to find a way out. So I'm very sorry to say, I think the war will go on. I think we will see Surovikin's sledgehammer fall at some point. Not sure when, not sure in what form. And I'm afraid the war will go on. And in the meantime, the West will try to find some way to re-engage economically with Russia, even if they don't really have any clear idea of how to do that without themselves losing face. So that's where we are as of today. No doubt there'll be more developments fairly soon, but that seems to me as much as we can say today. Thank you for joining me once more. Remember, you can find all our videos, my videos, the Duran videos, on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget also to go to our shop and buy the great magic mugs and hats and hoodies and t-shirts and other things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.